In a tobacco barn in central Virginia, 17 enslaved men entered through its doors on Saturday nights between 1837 and 1839. Only 3 of them were ever officially reported as dead. The other 14 simply vanished from all records, their names crossed out, their existence erased, their fate buried beneath a century of deliberate silence. What happened inside that barn wasn't agriculture, it wasn't punishment, it was entertainment. Wealthy plantation owners arrived in covered carriages after dark, carrying more money than most people would see in a lifetime. All of it wagered on a single question: which man would walk out alive, and which would be carried out in pieces? The fights weren't about discipline or control. They were about profit. And the rules were simple. There were none. No stopping, no mercy, no escape until one man couldn't stand anymore. What you're about to hear is the story of how one plantation owner turned human beings into gladiators. How Saturday nights became execution spectacles disguised as sport. And how the 17 men who disappeared were destroyed not by disease or accident, but by something far more calculated and far more profitable. Before we continue with the story of Nathaniel Devo and the 17 names that disappeared from his ledgers, I want you to do something for me. If this is your first time listening to stories like this, stories that reveal the darkest corners of American history, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, and tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from right now? I want to know where you are as we uncover together what really happened in those tobacco fields. This isn't speculation or legend. The evidence exists in fragmented property records, in testimonies given decades later by those who survived, and in the unmarked graves that were finally discovered when that land was cleared in 1911. Cumberland County, Virginia, in the year 1837 was a place where tobacco still ruled as king, though the soil had begun to show its exhaustion. The great plantations that had flourished in the previous century now struggled with declining yields, forcing landowners to seek new sources of income or face financial ruin. The county sat in that peculiar geography where the Piedmont begins its gentle roll toward the Appalachian foothills, far enough from Richmond to avoid scrutiny, close enough to waterways to maintain commerce, isolated enough that what happened on private land stayed private. The Devo plantation comprised nearly 800 acres, most of it planted in tobacco with sections given over to corn and wheat. Nathaniel Devo had inherited the property from his father in 1829, along with 43 enslaved people, a substantial debt, and a reputation for harshness that his father had cultivated over 3 decades. Nathaniel was 31 years old when he took control, a thin man with dark hair that he wore unfashionably long, a sharp nose, and eyes that servants described as always calculating, always measuring what you were worth. He had spent his 20s in Richmond and Norfolk gambling in private clubs where plantation sons gathered to lose their inheritances at cards and dice. He had developed not just a taste for gambling, but a system. He watched men bet, studied what made them wager more, learned how to create excitement that loosened purses. When his father died and the creditors came calling, Nathaniel returned to Cumberland County with empty pockets and a mind full of schemes. The enslaved community on the Devo plantation lived in 2 rows of cabins behind the main house. Rough structures with clay-chinked walls and dirt floors where families crowded into spaces barely large enough for sleep. They worked the tobacco from March until November, their days measured by the sun's position and the overseer's watch. The overseer was a man named Garrett Sutcliffe, who had worked for Nathaniel's father and stayed on despite the change in ownership. Sutcliffe was nearly 50, built like a barrel with hands scarred from years of handling rope and leather. He carried a hickory walking stick that he used equally for support and for discipline. Among the enslaved population, there existed a hierarchy born of skill and favor. The house servants, 3 women and 1 elderly man, occupied a position of relative privilege, while the field hands endured the worst conditions. But there were also the skilled laborers, Benjamin the blacksmith, whose forge sat near the main barn, Marcus the carpenter, who could repair anything wooden, and several others whose specialized abilities made them valuable beyond simple field labor. It was Benjamin who had become central to what followed, a man of perhaps 30 years, though enslaved people rarely knew their exact ages. He stood over 6 feet tall with shoulders broadened by years of swinging hammers, and hands that could bend iron, but also carve delicate hinges for ladies' jewelry boxes. He had been born on the plantation, his mother having died when he was young. His father sold away when he was 12. Benjamin spoke little, worked constantly, and had earned a measure of respect even from Sutcliffe, who rarely struck him because Benjamin's skills were too valuable to risk injury. In the spring of 1837, Nathaniel Devo faced a crisis. The previous year's tobacco crop had been damaged by an early frost, and the profit from its sale barely covered half the interest on his inherited debts. His creditors, mostly merchants in Richmond, began making threats about foreclosure. Nathaniel had always prided himself on his cleverness, his ability to extract himself from difficult situations through wit rather than honest work. As he sat in his father's old study, surrounded by account books that told the story of steady decline, he began to consider his assets differently. He owned land, but land required labor to be profitable, and labor required capital he didn't have. He owned enslaved people, but their value was theoretical until he sold them, and selling them would only hasten the plantation's collapse. What he needed was a way to generate immediate income without depleting his resources, something that would bring money directly to him, bypassing the uncertainties of agriculture altogether. The idea came to him in May during a conversation with his nearest neighbor, a planter named Harrison Fentress. They sat on Devo's porch drinking whiskey as the evening cooled, discussing their mutual financial troubles. Fentress mentioned that he'd recently attended a gathering in Lynchburg where men had bet on a fight between two enslaved men, and the amounts wagered had been extraordinary. "Not boxing, you understand?" Fentress said, his words slightly slurred from drink. "A real fight. No rules, no stopping until one couldn't continue. Crude entertainment, but the gentlemen there were passing money around like it was nothing. I heard the house took in over $300 that evening." Nathaniel said nothing, but his mind had already begun working, calculating, envisioning possibilities. That night, he lay awake in his father's old bed, staring at the ceiling, and by dawn he had made his decision. On a Saturday evening in late June, Nathaniel gathered 6 of his strongest field hands in the old tobacco barn, a structure that had once been used for drying and storage but now stood mostly empty, its purpose obsolete since the plantation had built a larger facility closer to the fields. The barn was isolated, sitting nearly a quarter-mile from the slave quarters and even farther from the main house, surrounded by a stand of oak trees that muffled sound. Benjamin was among those 6 men summoned from his forge by Sutcliffe and told to bring his tools. The others were field hands: Isaac, a young man of perhaps 20 with quick movements; Daniel, older and more cautious; Joseph, Samuel, and Robert, whose specific features have been lost to history, but whose presence in that barn that evening would determine their fates. Nathaniel stood in the center of the barn floor, which had been cleared of debris. Sutcliffe stood beside him with his hickory stick. 2 lanterns hung from the rafters, casting long shadows across the dirt floor. The men stood in a rough semicircle, confused about why they'd been brought here as darkness fell. "I have work for you," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying a false friendliness that made the men more nervous, not less. "Different work? Better work in some ways. You'll be compensated, not with money, of course, but with privileges, better food, less time in the fields, perhaps even tobacco for those of you who want it." He paused, studying their faces, reading the mixture of suspicion and desperate hope that any promise of relief would bring. "What I need," he continued, "is a demonstration of strength, a test of skill." Benjamin stepped forward. Benjamin moved toward Nathaniel, his expression carefully neutral. "You're the strongest man on this plantation." Nathaniel said, "Everyone knows it, but is Isaac faster? Is Daniel tougher? I want to find out. So here's what's going to happen. You and Isaac are going to fight a real fight, the kind men have always had to establish who deserves respect. The winner gets better rations for a month and no field work. The loser goes back to regular duties. Simple as that." The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. These men had lived long enough under slavery to know that nothing was ever simple, that any promise from a master came with hidden costs, that what sounded like opportunity often led to suffering. But they also knew that refusal wasn't an option. Benjamin looked at Isaac, who wouldn't meet his eyes. Isaac was young enough to be Benjamin's son, lean and quick, good with his hands when it came to delicate work like tying tobacco leaves. The idea of fighting him made Benjamin's stomach tighten. "I don't want to fight," Benjamin said quietly. Nathaniel's false friendliness evaporated. "I don't recall asking what you wanted." "Sutcliffe, remind Benjamin what happens when my instructions are questioned." Sutcliffe moved toward Benjamin with the hickory stick raised, but before he could strike, Benjamin spoke again. "I'll fight." What happened next lasted perhaps 10 minutes, though who were forced to watch said it felt like hours. Benjamin and Isaac circled each other on the dirt floor while Nathaniel and Sutcliffe observed. There were no rules given, no boundaries set, just the implicit understanding that they should fight until Nathaniel was satisfied. Isaac struck first, a quick jab that caught Benjamin on the jaw. Benjamin barely moved. He outweighed Isaac by 50 pounds and had no desire to hurt the younger man, but Isaac kept coming, driven by fear of what would happen if he didn't try. Benjamin defended himself, blocking strikes, pushing Isaac away without real force, trying to end this without causing injury. But Nathaniel wasn't satisfied. "This is pathetic," he said after a few minutes. I said, "A real fight. If I don't see blood in the next minute, you'll both get 20 lashes and spend a week in the root cellar." The threat transformed the encounter. Isaac came at Benjamin with desperate intensity, and Benjamin, seeing no way to protect them both, finally struck back. A single solid blow to Isaac's midsection that dropped the young man to his knees, gasping for air. Benjamin immediately moved to help him up, but Sutcliffe pushed him back. Nathaniel walked over to Isaac, crouched beside him, examined him like a buyer inspecting livestock. "Adequate," he finally said. "This will work. Saturday nights from now on, we'll have these contests. I'm going to invite some friends to watch. There will be betting. You'll all take turns fighting, and as I said, the winners will be rewarded." As the men filed out of the barn, Benjamin heard Nathaniel say to Sutcliffe, "Next week, invite Fentress and perhaps the Kincaid brothers. Start with modest stakes. We'll build from there." That night, in his cabin, Benjamin told his woman, Sarah, what had happened. Sarah was a field hand, small and fierce, who had survived 3 children being sold away before she was 30. She listened in silence, her face hardening. "He's going to kill someone," she said when Benjamin finished. "Maybe not," Benjamin said, though he didn't believe it. "He will," Sarah insisted, "because men who bet want excitement, and excitement means more violence, and more violence means someone dies. It's just a matter of when." She was right, though it would take several months before the inevitable occurred. The Saturday night fights became a fixture on the Devereux plantation throughout the summer and fall of 1837. Word spread among Cumberland County's planters discreetly through private conversations and hand-dealt notes that Nathaniel Devo was hosting sporting events that offered more genuine excitement than the usual card games and horse races. Men began arriving after dark in covered carriages, entering the property through a back road that avoided the main gate, parking near the tobacco barn, where lanterns now burned every Saturday evening. The fights themselves evolved rapidly, responding to the demands of the growing audience. What began as simple matches between 2 men expanded into a more elaborate system. Nathaniel kept records, a leather-bound journal where he tracked each fighter's wins and losses, their physical condition, their willingness to engage. He developed a ranking system and began organizing matches based on what he thought would generate the most betting interest. Benjamin fought 6 times between June and October. He won 4 matches, lost 2. The losses deliberate, calculated performances designed to keep himself useful, but not so dominant that he'd be forced into increasingly dangerous situations. He learned to read Nathaniel's moods, to understand when a fight needed to be convincing versus when it could be brief. He tried to protect the other fighters when he could, ending matches quickly before real damage occurred. Though this wasn't always possible, the money flowing into Nathaniel's pockets grew substantial. On a good Saturday night with 20 or 30 spectators, the total bets exchanged could reach $4 or $500, and Nathaniel took a percentage of every wager placed. He also charged admission $5 per gentleman and sold whiskey at inflated prices. Within 3 months, he had paid off his most pressing debts and began expanding his operation. He purchased 2 more enslaved men specifically for fighting. Both young, both strong, both bought from plantations where they'd been trouble. Their names were Thomas and William, and they arrived in chains with reputations for resistance. Nathaniel saw this as an advantage. Men with nothing to lose would fight with genuine ferocity. But the fundamental problem with Nathaniel's enterprise was that it existed in tension with economic reality. The men he was using as fighters were also his labor force. Every injury sustained in the barn was productivity lost in the fields. Every fighter who became too damaged to work effectively represented depreciated capital. Nathaniel needed his fighters to perform, but also to remain functional as enslaved laborers. This tension would drive him toward increasingly reckless decisions. The first serious injury occurred in October. A fighter named Samuel, one of the original 6 forced into the barn that first night, suffered a blow to his head during a match that left him confused and unsteady. He continued working, but his behavior became erratic. He would stop mid-task, staring at nothing, or suddenly become disoriented about where he was. Scliff reported this to Nathaniel, who observed Samuel for a few days before making his decision. "He's useless in the fields," Nathaniel told Sutcliffe. "Can't follow instructions. Can't remember tasks. He's costing me money every day he eats. Put him in the isolation cabin and reduce his rations. Maybe hunger will sharpen his mind." The isolation cabin was a windowless structure barely large enough to stand in, originally built for storing seed corn. Samuel spent 3 weeks there on quarter rations before he died. The official record filed with the County Clear listed the cause as fever and decline. No doctor examined him. No investigation occurred. His name was crossed out of Nathaniel's property ledger, his few possessions distributed among the remaining enslaved community, and his absence was noted only in the sudden silence where his voice had been. This death should have been a warning, a moment that forced Nathaniel to reconsider his enterprise. Instead, it taught him something different. That he could dispose of fighters who became too damaged to be useful. That the county wouldn't investigate too closely. That enslaved people could simply disappear from official records without consequence. This realization would prove catastrophic. The fights continued through winter, though less frequently due to cold weather that made the unheated barn uncomfortable for spectators. Nathaniel used this period to refine his operation. He installed a raised platform along one wall where wealthier spectators could sit and get a better view. He brought in sawdust to cover the dirt floor, which better absorbed blood and made cleanup easier. He established a betting system with formal odds, taking cues from the professional gambling houses he'd frequented in Richmond. He also began keeping more detailed records of each fighter's performance. Not just wins and losses, but information about fighting style, tolerance for pain, recovery time from injuries, and temperament under pressure. He approached the fights like a businessman optimizing a manufacturing process, constantly seeking ways to increase profit and efficiency. Benjamin, watching all this from his position as one of the primary fighters, understood what was happening. Nathaniel was escalating, the fights were lasting longer, the injuries were becoming more severe, and the crowd was developing an appetite for increased violence. Men who had initially seemed uncomfortable with the brutality were now shouting encouragement, demanding more aggressive action, betting on how long a fighter would stay conscious. In his forge. During the weeks when he was allowed to work there, Benjamin began hiding small amounts of money. Coins dropped by spectators overlooked in the sawdust and dirt of the barn floor. He had no clear plan for what he would do with this money, only an instinct that he would eventually need resources, that some opportunity for escape or resistance would present itself. And when it did, he needed to be prepared. Sarah, his woman, began making different preparations. She cultivated relationships with the house servants, learning everything she could about Nathaniel's movements, his habits, his weaknesses. She paid attention to which nights he drank heavily, which visitors stayed latest, where he kept his important papers. She couldn't read, but she understood that knowledge was a form of power, and she accumulated every scrap of information she could gather. By the spring of 1838, nearly a year after the first fight, the Saturday night matches had become Nathaniel's primary source of income. The plantation itself continued to decline. Tobacco yields dropped further, equipment broke and wasn't repaired. Fields that should have been fertilized and rotated were instead planted again and again until the soil was exhausted. Nathaniel had stopped thinking of himself as a planter. He was now something else. A purveyor of entertainment, an organizer of spectacle, a man who had discovered that blood and suffering could be monetized more efficiently than crops. The transformation in Nathaniel's enterprise became complete in April 1838, when a visitor arrived from Lynchburg, a man named Crawford Hastings, who operated several businesses of questionable legality in that growing industrial city. Hastings had heard about the Devo fights through the network of gamblers and sporting enthusiasts that existed across Virginia, and he came to Cumberland County with a proposal. They met in Nathaniel's study on a Tuesday afternoon. Hastings was a heavy-set man in his 50s, dressed in expensive but slightly worn clothes, with the look of someone who had once been prosperous and was working to maintain appearances. He carried a leather case that he set on Nathaniel's desk before getting to business. "I've been running similar operations for years," Hastings said. "In Baltimore, in Richmond, in Lynchburg, the problem is always the same. You start with simple matches, the crowd grows, the money increases, and then you hit a ceiling. The audience gets bored. They've seen two men fight. They want something more." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair. "What kind of more?" "Higher stakes. Not just who wins or loses, but life and death. Matches where fighters know that losing means more than embarrassment. It means everything." Hastings paused, watching Nathaniel's reaction. "You're already close to this." I heard about the man who died last fall. That wasn't an accident, was it? Nathaniel said nothing, which was answer enough. Hastings opened his leather case and pulled out a ledger book which he pushed across the desk. These are my records from the past 3 years. Look at the numbers. See how the revenue increases when you introduce mortality as a real possibility. Men will bet extraordinary amounts when they believe they're watching something truly dangerous, something that can't be undone. Nathaniel studied the numbers in the ledger, and what he saw made his pulse quicken. Hastings had been generating 4 or 5 times the revenue Nathaniel was currently making, all by embracing the logical endpoint of what they were doing. "You're talking about deliberately killing them," Nathaniel said, his voice careful. "I'm talking about creating conditions where death becomes a likely outcome," Hastings corrected. "There's a difference. You don't murder them yourself. You put 2 fighters together. You remove the usual constraints. You offer substantial incentive to the winner, and make clear what happens to the loser, and then you let nature take its course. Some matches end without death. Some don't. The uncertainty is what drives the betting." He closed his ledger and leaned forward. "I can help you set this up properly. I have connections to wealthy men across the state who would travel here for this kind of entertainment. We could make this operation 3 times as profitable within 2 months, but you need to be willing to accept the consequences." Nathaniel spent 3 days considering the proposal. The moral dimension barely troubled him. He had long since rationalized that enslaved people were property, that their suffering was simply an economic externality, that his financial survival justified whatever measures he needed to take. What concerned him more was the practical risk. Bodies were harder to dispose of than paperwork errors. If too many enslaved people died, even the lax oversight of Cumberland County might eventually notice. But Hastings had answers for these concerns as well. When they met again on Friday, he laid out a complete system: how to vary the fighters so no single man disappeared too often, how to stage deaths to look like accidents or natural causes, how to bribe the county clear to overlook discrepancies in property records, how to dispose of bodies in ways that left no evidence. He had refined this over years of practice, and he spoke about it with the casual confidence of someone discussing tobacco cultivation. Nathaniel agreed to the partnership on Saturday morning. That evening, the nature of the fights changed forever. The first match under the new system involved Thomas and William, the 2 men Nathaniel had purchased specifically for fighting, both known for their resistance and strength. The barn was crowded with over 40 spectators, including several Hastings had brought from Lynchburg. The atmosphere felt different from previous Saturday nights. There was an anticipatory tension in the air, a sense that something unprecedented was about to occur. Nathaniel addressed the crowd before the match began. "Gentlemen, tonight's contest will proceed without the usual constraints. The fighters will continue until one cannot continue. There will be no intervention, no stopping for injury, no mercy shown. I encourage betting accordingly." The fight lasted 43 minutes. What happened in that time exceeded the worst expectations of even those who had advocated for this escalation. When it ended, Thomas was unconscious on the sawdust-covered floor, his face so damaged that he was barely recognizable, and William stood over him shaking, his hands covered in blood, unable to process what he'd just been forced to do. Thomas survived another 6 days, never regaining full consciousness before dying in the isolation cabin. His death was recorded as consumption and decline. His body was buried in an unmarked grave in the woods beyond the plantation's cultivated fields in a location known only to Sutcliffe and 2 enslaved men who were forced to dig the hole and sworn to silence under threat of the same fate. The money generated that night exceeded anything Nathaniel had previously collected. Hastings' connections had brought wealthy spectators willing to bet amounts that field hands couldn't earn in a lifetime of labor. When Nathaniel counted his share after everyone left, he had nearly $800, more than his best tobacco harvest had ever brought. Benjamin, who had been forced to watch from the side of the barn, understood exactly what had happened. This wasn't fighting anymore. This was execution dressed up as sport, and he understood with absolute clarity that every man fighting in this barn was now living on borrowed time, that Nathaniel had crossed a threshold he wouldn't walk back from, that the only question was which of them would die next and how long the rest would survive. That night, back in his cabin, Benjamin told Sarah, "I need you to do something. There's a woman named Rachel who works in the Fentress house 3 plantations south. She has connections to free black people in Lynchburg who help people escape. You need to get word to her. Tell her we need help, not just me. All of us, everyone in this barn Saturday nights. Sarah looked at him with tears in her eyes. You know what they do to people who try to run? I know what they're doing to people who stay, Benjamin said. Over the next 4 months, between April and August of 1838, 6 more enslaved men died as a result of injuries sustained in Nathaniel's barn. Not all died immediately. Some lasted days or weeks, suffering from internal injuries, infections, or damage that slowly destroyed their capacity to survive. Each death was recorded as something else: fever, heart failure, accident, consumption. The county records showed nothing unusual. The plantation ledgers simply showed a declining number of enslaved laborers, which could be explained by sale or natural causes. Hastings came to Cumberland County every Saturday now, bringing new spectators, expanding the network of men willing to pay for this specific form of entertainment. The barn could hold perhaps 50 men comfortably, and it was regularly full. The betting pools grew larger, sometimes reaching $1,000 or more. Nathaniel was making more money than his plantation had earned in its best years, and he reinvested some of this profit into the operation itself. Better lanterns, a second platform for premium spectators, even a separate entrance for men who wanted to arrive discreetly. But the operation created problems that money couldn't solve. The enslaved community on the plantation lived in terror, knowing that any man could be selected for the next fight. That refusing meant immediate punishment. That winning only meant you'd have to fight again. Field productivity collapsed. People worked slowly with a kind of hollow-eyed desperation, waiting to see which of their community would be next to disappear. Benjamin had fought twice more under the new system, winning both matches by being faster and more strategic than his opponents, ending fights before they reached the worst extremes. But he knew this couldn't continue. He was 30 years old, perhaps a bit older, and some of the men now being brought into the barn were younger, faster, more desperate. Eventually, someone would be faster than him, or he would make a mistake, or Nathaniel would decide he'd become too expensive to keep alive. Sarah had managed to get word to Rachel at the Fentress plantation, and Rachel had sent back a message through the invisible network of enslaved people who communicated across property lines. There were people in Lynchburg who could help, but the cost would be high. Not money exactly, but risk. The escape route required traveling nearly 40 miles north, crossing multiple rivers, avoiding patrols, and timing everything perfectly, and Benjamin wouldn't be able to do it alone. If he ran, Sarah would be punished in his place. They would both need to go along with anyone else willing to risk everything. Benjamin began quietly approaching the other fighters, testing their willingness to act. Some were too broken by fear to consider it. Others were too angry to think clearly. But a few, William, who had killed Thomas and hadn't been the same since. Isaac, the young man from the first fight who now bore scars across his face, and a man named Elijah, recently purchased and not yet fully beaten down. Yet these men listened when Benjamin talked about escape. It won't be easy, Benjamin told them one night in whispered conversation behind the barn during a rare moment when they weren't being watched. And most people who run don't make it, but everyone who stays here is going to die. Maybe not next week, maybe not next month, but eventually we're more profitable dead than alive now. You understand that, right? William nodded slowly. When soon? Benjamin said. Within the month. There's a route north. People who can hide us, but we need to time it right. When Nathaniel is distracted, when the barn is full and everyone's drunk and paying attention to the fights instead of counting heads. But before they could finalize any plan, something happened that changed all calculations. On a Saturday night in mid-August, during a fight between 2 men whose names weren't recorded, one of the spectators suffered a stroke. The man, a wealthy planter from Lynchburg named Theodore Marsden, collapsed during the match, gasping and clutching his chest, and died within minutes despite efforts to revive him. The crowd panicked. Suddenly, these men who had been comfortable watching enslaved people die were confronted with the death of one of their own, and it shattered the illusion of safety they'd constructed. Several spectators left immediately, and by the end of the evening, Nathaniel was facing a crisis. Marsden had been one of Hastings' most reliable contacts, a man whose presence had brought other wealthy spectators. His death would draw attention, questions, possibly investigation. Hastings and Nathaniel met late that night after everyone else had left, standing in the barn amid the sawdust and blood and lantern smoke. "This is a problem," Hastings said. "Marsden's family will want to know what he was doing here. They're prominent people. We can't just say he had a stroke and leave it at that." "What do you suggest?" Nathaniel asked. "We need to shut down for a while. A month? Maybe 2. Let this settle. Come up with a story about tonight that doesn't involve the fights. Say he was here looking at horses or discussing tobacco contracts. Something legitimate." Nathaniel shook his head. "I can't afford to shut down. I've got debts again. Spent too much expanding this operation. I need the Saturday night revenue." "Then you're a fool," Hastings said flatly. "This kind of thing draws investigation. You keep running these fights right now, and someone's going to start asking questions we can't answer." They argued for another hour before Hastings left, angry and worried. Nathaniel stood alone in the barn, calculating his options, and reached a decision that would determine everything that followed. He wouldn't shut down. Instead, he would accelerate. He would run fights every Saturday for the next month, generate as much revenue as possible, and then, if necessary, he would shut down permanently, sell the plantation, and move somewhere his reputation hadn't preceded him. But he needed that final month of income to make this possible. What Nathaniel didn't know was that Benjamin and the others, sensing the instability in the operation, had moved up their escape timeline. They had decided to run on the first Saturday in September during a fight night when security would be focused on the barn and the spectators rather than on the quarters. They had gotten word to their contacts in Lynchburg, secured promises of shelter, and identified the route they would take north. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Cumberland County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in Benjamin's desperate plan for freedom. The first Saturday in September, 1838 arrived with unseasonably cool weather. A relief after the brutal heat of August, Nathaniel had scheduled 3 fights for the evening, expecting a full crowd despite the tensions following Marsden's death. Some spectators had stayed away, but enough remained, drawn by the reputation of the Devo barn, by the promise of violence that exceeded anything available elsewhere, that Nathaniel anticipated another profitable night. Benjamin was scheduled to fight in the final match of the evening against a recently purchased man named Jacob, who was known for his size and strength. Benjamin had seen Jacob fight once before and knew this would be difficult. Jacob was younger, heavier, and had nothing to lose, which made him dangerous in ways that went beyond physical capability. But Benjamin wasn't planning to be there for the fight. By the time his match was scheduled to begin, he and the others would be miles away, moving through darkness toward the first checkpoint on their route to freedom. The plan was simple in concept, though execution would be difficult. During the second fight of the evening, when the barn was full and attention was focused on the 2 men in the center, Benjamin, William, Isaac, and Elijah would slip away from the holding area where fighters waited. Sarah and 3 other women who had decided to risk everything would meet them at a predetermined location behind the old corn crib. From there, they would head north, staying off main roads, moving through forests and fields, aiming to cover 15 miles before dawn. They had one advantage. No one would notice their absence until Benjamin failed to appear for his scheduled match, and by then, they would have at least an hour's head start. Nathaniel would be drunk by the 3rd fight. He always was. And Sutcliffe would be managing the crowd, collecting bets, maintaining order. The other enslaved people on the plantation knew what was happening, but they wouldn't say anything. They had too much to lose and nothing to gain from betraying the escape attempt. The first 2 fights proceeded as planned. Benjamin and the others waited in the holding area, a corner of the barn separated by a canvas curtain, and listened to the sounds from beyond. The crowds shouting, the impact of flesh on flesh, the occasional scream. When the second fight was reaching its conclusion, they moved. Benjamin went first, slipping through a gap in the barn's rear wall that he deliberately widened during his work as blacksmith, making repairs that intentionally left access points. William followed, then Isaac, then Elijah. They crossed the open ground behind the barn in a crouch, staying in shadows, moving toward the corn crib where Sarah and the women waited. But something went wrong. One of the house servants, a woman named Meg, who hadn't been told about the escape because they didn't trust her loyalty, saw the movement and became alarmed. She had seen enslaved people punished for less suspicious behavior, and she made a decision that she probably believed was self-preservation, she told Sutcliffe. Sutcliffe was standing near the barn entrance when Mag approached him, and when she whispered what she'd seen, his face went dark with understanding. He immediately moved to the holding area, discovered it empty, and went straight to Nathaniel, who was standing with a group of spectators, a glass of whiskey in his hand, watching the second fight end. "They've run," Cliff said quietly, pulling Nathaniel aside, Benjamin, and at least 3 others. Just now, during the fight, Nathaniel's expression transformed from drunken pleasure to cold fury. "Get the dogs, wake the overseer from the concade place, and tell him we're paying for his services tonight. Round up every man here who's willing to ride and offer $50 to whoever brings them back. Move now." Within 15 minutes, the barn had emptied as men mounted horses and organized into hunting parties. Dogs were unleashed. Bloodhounds kept for exactly this purpose, trained to track human scent. The Saturday night entertainment had suddenly transformed into something more immediate and primal, a manhunt. Benjamin and the others were a mile and a half away when they heard the first dogs baying in the distance. They were moving through a section of pine forest, following a creek that would mask their scent, but the sound of pursuit was unmistakable. Sarah, running beside Benjamin, gasped out words between breaths. "They know already. We didn't get enough time." Benjamin made a decision. "Split up, William. You take Elijah and head northeast toward the Lynchburg Road. The rest of us go north through the wetlands. They can't track both groups equally." William nodded and veered away with Elijah. The 2 groups separated, and Benjamin led Sarah, Isaac, and the 3 women north toward a section of swampy ground that would be difficult for horses and dogs to navigate. They ran for another hour, their lungs burning, their legs trembling with exhaustion. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew sometimes louder, sometimes fainter, as the hunting parties spread out across the countryside. They crossed 2 more creeks, climbed through tangled underbrush, passed through a section of old-growth forest where the canopy was so thick that barely any moonlight penetrated. Just before midnight, they reached the edge of a swamp, a section of wetland that locals avoided because the ground was treacherous, full of sinkholes and quicksand and water that could be knee one moment and neck-deep the next. Benjamin had learned about this area from other enslaved people who had mapped every dangerous location for miles around. Information passed down as a form of protection and strategy. "Through the swamp," Benjamin said. "It's the only way we lose the dogs for sure." They waded into dark water, feeling their way forward, testing each step before committing their weight. The water was cold and thick with vegetation. Strange sounds echoed across the swamp, birds, frogs, things splashing in the darkness. They moved slowly, terrified of making noise that would give away their position. Behind them, perhaps a quarter-mile back, they could hear the dogs reaching the swamp's edge and the confusion of the hunters trying to decide whether to follow or circle around. Most of the hunting party chose to circle, but at least one group, led by Sutcliffe himself, entered the swamp on horseback, determined not to let the escapees gain ground. Benjamin and the others were halfway through the swamp when they heard Sutcliffe's voice calling out through the darkness. "Benjamin, I know you can hear me. You're not getting away. Come back now. And Devo promises only 30 lashes. Keep running and you'll hang all of you." No one answered. They kept moving forward through water that sometimes rose to their chests, past trees draped with moss, deeper into the swamp's dark heart. And then Sarah, who was directly behind Benjamin, suddenly dropped beneath the surface with barely a sound. There one moment, gone the next, pulled down by quicksand or a sinkhole, her hand slipping from Isaac's grip before anyone could react. Benjamin turned back, reaching into the dark water, feeling for her, finding her arm and pulling with all his strength. She came up gasping, her eyes wide with terror, and he dragged her to slightly more solid ground, both of them shaking. "We can't stop," Benjamin whispered, even though every instinct screamed to rest to make sure Sarah was all right to take stock of their situation. "We have to keep moving." They continued north through the swamp for another mile before finally emerging on the far side, exhausted and soaked, their skin covered in mud and scratches. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had faded. Either the hunting party had given up or had taken a different route. The terrain on the far side of the swamp shifted to rolling farmland, dotted with small homesteads that belonged to Eamon farmers who worked their own land without enslaved labor. This was dangerous territory in a different way. These farmers had no sympathy for runaways and would report them immediately for the reward money. Benjamin led the group in a wide arc around the visible farmhouses, keeping to tree lines and ravines, moving as silently as 6 exhausted people could manage. Dawn was perhaps 2 hours away when they reached the barn where Benjamin had been told they would find shelter. It sat at the edge of a property that looked abandoned from the road, sagging fences, overgrown fields. But as they approached, Benjamin saw signs of recent activity. Fresh wagon tracks, smoke residue near a chimney, livestock sounds from inside the structure. He whistled softly, a specific pattern he'd been taught, and waited. A door opened, and a figure emerged carrying a lantern. The man was perhaps 45, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who worked outdoors in all seasons. He raised the lantern, studied the group for a long moment, then gestured urgently for them to come inside. "Move quickly," the man said. "Patrols increase at dawn, and you've left tracks even in the dark. I'm Josiah Hendress. Get inside, and we'll discuss what comes next." They stumbled into the barn, which was warmer than outside and smelled of hay and horses. Hicks closed the door behind them and hung the lantern on a hook, then turned to count heads. "The others?" Chris asked. "There was supposed to be 7 of you." "2 split off?" Benjamin said, his voice from exertion and fear. William and Elijah headed northeast, toward the Lynchburg Road. Hicks's face darkened with an expression that told Benjamin everything he needed to know before the man even spoke. "That's the wrong direction. That road has slave patrols every night. Planners from 3 counties organized them after those runaways from Buckingham made it through last spring. If your friends went that way," he didn't finish the sentence, but the meaning was clear enough. Benjamin sat down heavily on a bale of hay, his head in his hands. They had escaped, some of them, but the cost was already mounting. William and Elijah were likely captured or dead. Sarah had nearly drowned. And even now, even in this moment of temporary safety, they all knew this was just the beginning. They had 40 miles still to go, and every mile would be more dangerous than the last. Hicks brought them water and cold cornbread, then disappeared into an adjacent room. When he returned, he carried a bundle of old clothes, rough homespun that would help them blend in as free laborers rather than plantation runaways. "Change into these," he said. "Your current clothes mark you too clearly. We'll burn what you're wearing now." As they changed, Hicks explained the next stage of their journey. "You'll rest here until tomorrow night. Can't move during daylight. Too many eyes on the roads. Tomorrow after dark, my brother will take you in his wagon to the next station about 15 miles north. You'll be hidden under hay and seed bags. If we're stopped, you stay absolutely silent no matter what you hear. The patrols have been using dogs, so we'll mask your scent with turpentine and tobacco leaves." "How many people have you helped?" Benjamin asked. Hicks was quiet for a moment, enough that if I'm caught, I'll hang. They don't forgive white men who help runaways. Last year, a farmer in Appomattox was caught hiding a family. They sold his property, gave him 50 lashes, and ran him out of Virginia. He was one of the lucky ones. The weight of that statement settled over the group. These people were risking everything. Their livelihoods, their freedom, their lives to help strangers escape bondage. The enormity of that courage set against the casual cruelty of men like Nathaniel who would destroy lives for profit and entertainment created a moral contrast so stark that Benjamin felt something shift inside him. He had spent 30 years learning to survive by being careful, by avoiding notice, by accepting the reality of his powerlessness. But this moment, sitting in a barn with people who had chosen resistance over safety, taught him that the world contained more possibilities than he had allowed himself to imagine. William and Elijah were captured before dawn on Sunday morning, found hiding in a tobacco barn 6 miles from the Devo plantation. They were returned in chains and taken directly to the main barn where Nathaniel and Sutcliffe were waiting. What happened to them over the next 2 days was never officially recorded, but the enslaved community on the plantation heard their screams and understood the message being sent. Both men were dead by Tuesday. Their deaths were recorded as injuries sustained during apprehension and fever following capture, respectively. Their bodies were buried in the same unmarked section of woods where Thomas and the others had been laid. The county clerk who processed the death certificates was the same man who had been accepting bribes from Nathaniel for months. He asked no questions and filed the papers without comment. News of the captures and deaths reached Benjamin 3 days into his journey north. Carried through the network of safe houses and contacts that operated across Virginia. A conductor on the route, a free black woman who transported messages hidden in her sewing basket, told him what had happened while he and the others waited in a root cellar beneath a church in Appomattox County. Benjamin received the news in silence, his face showing nothing, but Sarah saw his hands trembling and knew that he was carrying new weight that would never fully lift. "They died because of choices I made," Benjamin said later that night, lying in the darkness of the root cellar while the others slept. "They died because of choices Nathaniel Devo made." Sarah corrected him, her voice fierce in the darkness. Don't you dare take that weight on yourself. William and Elijah knew the risks we all did. They made their own choice to run, and what happened after wasn't your fault." Benjamin stayed silent, but her words, whether he fully believed them or not, were something he would return to in the years that followed. A counterweight to the guilt that threatened to consume him whenever he thought about the men who didn't make it out. The journey to Pennsylvania took another week, each leg presenting new dangers and requiring new reserves of courage from people who were already operating beyond the limits of their endurance. They traveled hidden in wagons, in false-bottomed boats, in the attics of houses that looked abandoned but concealed entire networks of resistance. They passed through communities where enslaved and free black people maintained sophisticated communication systems, where Quaker families risked everything to operate safe houses, where poor white farmers who had no love for the plantation system offered shelter because they believed that no person should own another. Not everyone made it. One of the women, a field and named Rachel, who had worked beside Sarah for years, fell ill with fever during the journey, likely from exposure during their night in the swamp. She was left at a safe house in the mountains, too sick to continue with promises that she would be cared for, and sent north when she recovered. Benjamin never learned whether she survived. That uncertainty would haunt him alongside the confirmed deaths, a question mark that could never be resolved. The others reached Pennsylvania on September 23, 1838. Crossing the border in early morning fog that made the landscape look like something from a dream. They had been traveling for 22 days, covering approximately 200 meters through terrain that ranged from swampland to mountains. When Josiah Hendriss's brother, who had guided them through the final leg, told them they were across the border, that they were standing on free soil, none of them could quite process the information. Freedom had been an abstraction for so long that its reality felt impossible to grasp. Benjamin settled in Philadelphia, where the free black community was large enough to offer some protection from slave catchers, but organized enough to provide support for new arrivals. He found work as a blacksmith in a shop owned by a man who asked few questions about his past and paid fair wages. Sarah stayed with him, and they married properly, legally, with papers that recognized their union in ways that had been impossible in Virginia. The ceremony was small, held in a church basement with just a handful of witnesses, but it represented something profound: the ability to make choices about their own lives. Isaac found work in a shipyard where his youth and strength made him valuable. The three women who had made the journey with them scattered to different parts of the city, finding domestic work and building new lives. They stayed in contact, meeting occasionally in the church where they had been married, sharing meals and stories, and the comfort of being among people who understood what they had survived. But freedom came with its own burdens. Benjamin and the others lived constantly aware that fugitive slave laws meant they were never entirely safe, that slave catchers operated even in free states, that recapture was a possibility that hung over every interaction with strangers. They learned to be careful about who they trusted, to avoid situations where their lack of free papers could be questioned, to always have an escape route planned. The psychological toll of this permanent vigilance was something that never fully disappeared, a background tension that colored even moments of genuine joy. Benjamin also carried the weight of survivor's guilt, the knowledge that he had escaped while 17 other men had died in Nathaniel's barn, that William and Elijah had been captured and killed during an escape he had organized, that Rachel's fate remained unknown. In quiet moments, he would think about the men whose names he remembered and those he had never known, wondering if his survival was somehow purchased with their deaths. It was an irrational thought, he knew. He hadn't killed those men, hadn't organized the fights, hadn't created the system that had destroyed them. But guilt rarely operates according to logic. Sarah helped him navigate these dark periods, reminding him that bearing witness was its own form of resistance. That surviving and telling the truth about what happened was a way of honoring the dead rather than betraying them. It was her encouragement that eventually led him to speak publicly about his experiences, though it would take decades before he felt safe enough to do so. Back in Cumberland County, Nathaniel Devo's operation collapsed within weeks of the escape. The manhunt had drawn too much attention from neighboring plantations and county authorities who had previously been content to ignore rumors about the Saturday night activities in his barn. Questions were asked about the unusual number of enslaved people who had died on his property, about the wealthy men who had been visiting regularly, about whether the deceased Theodore Marsden had really been there to discuss tobacco contracts as claimed. Hastings disappeared back to Lynchburg and cut all ties with Nathaniel, unwilling to risk his own operations being exposed. Several of the regular spectators, worried about their reputations, began spreading stories that distanced themselves from the fights, claiming they had only attended once or twice, that they hadn't realized the full nature of what was happening, that they had been uncomfortable with the violence. The coordination of these denials suggested that the wealthier participants had agreed among themselves to present a unified version of events that minimized their involvement. Nathaniel held one more fight night in late September, desperately trying to generate revenue, but barely a dozen spectators showed up. The mood was tense rather than excited, and the betting was cautious. The magic that had made the barn profitable, the sense of transgression, of witnessing something extraordinary and forbidden, had been broken by the escape and the attention it brought. By the end of the evening, Nathaniel understood that his enterprise was finished. The following week, his creditors began foreclosure proceedings. The debts he had accumulated while expanding the fighting operation, combined with years of declining tobacco revenues, had left him financially exposed. Without the Saturday night income, he had no way to service these debts. By November, the plantation was being auctioned to pay what he owed, and Nathaniel himself had left Virginia, relocating to Mississippi with whatever money he'd managed to hide from creditors. He would attempt to rebuild in that new location, but his reputation, at least among those who knew the full story, had been permanently damaged. The barn, where the fights had occurred, stood empty for several years, avoided by the enslaved community on the new owner's plantation, and regarded with unease, even by those who didn't know its full history. There was something about the structure that felt wrong. Too many people had suffered there. Too much pain had soaked into the wood and earth. In 1842, the new owner of the property, a man named Patterson, who had bought it cheaply at auction, said he felt uncomfortable with the structure and ordered it demolished. The wood was burned in a fire that lasted most of a day, and the site was plowed under and planted with wheat. Patterson never explained exactly why he wanted the barn destroyed, but workers on the plantation claimed he had gone inside once, stayed for perhaps 5 minutes, and emerged looking disturbed, saying only that the place made his skin crawl. The unmarked graves in the woods remained undiscovered for decades. It wasn't until 1911, when that section of land was being cleared for a railroad spur, that workers found bones. Multiple sets buried without ceremony or markers, some showing signs of trauma that suggested violent deaths. A brief investigation concluded they were probably enslaved people who had died in the 1830s or 1840s, but without records or witnesses. Nothing more could be determined. The bones were re-earied in a county cemetery with a simple marker reading, "Unknown Persons, 1830-1850. No one connected these remains to Nathaniel Devo or his fighting barn. That history had been successfully buried beneath decades of silence. Benjamin lived until 1876, dying at approximately 69 years old in Philadelphia, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had never known slavery. Before his death, he gave an interview to a black newspaper reporter who was collecting stories from formerly enslaved people. In that interview, he talked about his years in Virginia, about the plantation, about the fights, and about the men who died. The reporter, a young man named Frederick Hammond, was horrified by what he heard and asked Benjamin how he could bear to remember such things. "People ask me sometimes if I ever felt guilty for surviving when so many others didn't," Benjamin said near the end of the interview, and I tell them, no, survival isn't something to feel guilty about. What happened in that barn, what Devo did, that wasn't our fault. That was done to us, not by us. The guilt belongs entirely to the men who organized it, who bet on it, who watched it happen and did nothing. Every man who walked into that barn and placed a wager was complicit in murder, and they all walked away. That's what should haunt people, not that some of us survived. He paused, looking out the window of his small house in Philadelphia, then continued. I tell this story not because I want sympathy, but because someone needs to remember those men. Their names were erased from the records. Their graves have no markers, but they lived and they suffered, and they deserve to be remembered. Thomas, Samuel, William, Elijah. I say their names because no one else will. The interview was published in Frederick Douglass's newspaper in 1876, a few months before Benjamin's death, but it drew little attention at the time. Reconstruction was collapsing, and the nation had little appetite for stories that highlighted the worst aspects of slavery when it was trying to move forward with reconciliation between North and South. The article was forgotten, filed away in archives that wouldn't be seriously examined for another century. In the 1930s, a WPA project to collect oral histories from formerly enslaved people recorded testimony from several descendants of the Devo plantation's enslaved community. These interviews, conducted with elderly people who had been children in the 1850s and 1860s, included references to the fighting barn and to stories passed down about men who disappeared in the late 1830s. One woman interviewed in 1937, when she was 93 years old, said her grandmother had told her about Saturday nights when they would hear screams from the barn and know that someone else was being destroyed for white men's entertainment. The interviewers noted these stories but didn't investigate further. The focus was on documenting daily life under slavery, not on pursuing specific allegations of violence that couldn't be proven. It wasn't until the 1980s that a graduate student studying plantation records in Virginia came across Nathaniel Devo's property ledgers and noticed the pattern. 17 enslaved men's names crossed out between 1837 and 1839, with only 3 deaths officially recorded. The student, doing research for a dissertation on plantation economics, began investigating further and eventually found Benjamin's 1876 interview, the WPA testimonies, and scattered references in neighboring plantations' records to the sporting events at the Devo property. The full story, or as much as could be reconstructed from fragmentary evidence, was published in a historical journal in 1989. It received modest academic attention, but was largely unknown outside scholarly circles until recently, when renewed interest in the complete history of American slavery brought these kinds of stories back to light. Today, the site of the Devo plantation is partially preserved as a historical marker, though the text on the marker makes no mention of the fighting barn or what occurred there. The land itself has been subdivided and developed: homes, a small shopping center, a section of highway. The woods where the unmarked graves were found have been cleared, the railroad spur long since abandoned and removed. Nothing visible remains of what happened there except scattered references in archives, testimonies recorded by people who are long dead, and the persistent oral histories maintained by descendants of those who survived and those who didn't. The question that haunts anyone who studies this story is not whether it happened. The evidence, though incomplete, is convincing, but how many other places like this existed? How many other plantations in how many other counties organized similar operations, generated similar profits, destroyed similar numbers of lives, and left behind no records at all? Benjamin's survival and his willingness to speak about what happened was exceptional. Most who experienced such horrors either died or chose silence, unable or unwilling to relive the trauma by speaking publicly about it. This mystery shows us that the worst aspects of history are often those that were most profitable to hide, that official records tell only the stories that powerful people chose to preserve, and that truth depends on the courage of witnesses to speak even when no one wants to listen. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do you think there are darker details still hidden in archives waiting to be discovered? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this investigation into hidden history and want more stories that reveal uncomfortable truths, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who understands that we can't move forward without confronting the past honestly. See you in the next video.